picture a frostbitten dawn in 1879, Arizona territory, where Margaret Hale, a widowed seamstress scarred by loss, knelt beside a dying Apache woman, her trembling hands clutching a blood-soaked blanket. They called Margaret a ghost, haunted by her husband's murder. The stranger carried a child no one expected to survive. Yet in that crumbling stable, a single act of mercy sparked a fire that could burn down a century of hate or ignite a war. Would one woman's compassion rewrite the frontier's bloodiest chapter? This story's ending left millions weeping. Hit subscribe, share your hometown below, and stay until the final hoofbeat. Can a wooden eagle outlast a battlefield's shadow? Let's find out together. Frost clawed the Arizona territory in the winter of 1879, sharp as a skinning knife, slicing through the northern plains, where Margaret Hale's cabin sagged like a tired mule. The widow, barely past 30, wore her grief like a duster coat, heavy, dust-stained, never shed. 2 years ago, her husband bled out on this same trail, caught in a skirmish with Apache raiders, or so the whispers said. No one knew for sure. No one cared enough to ask. Margaret didn't touch a rifle since she didn't speak of vengeance. She stitched coats from mercenaries and boarded their horses, her hands steady, her eyes hollow. The townsfolk called her a ghost, drifting at the edge of their world. That morning, dawn broke thin, sifting pale light through a veil of fog. The grass crunched under her boots, brittle with ice. She hauled a bucket to the pump, breath clouding in the chill, when something caught her eye. A smear of red in the frost, trailing from the field toward the old stable. Her pulse quickened. The stable, half collapsed, was a place she avoided. The wind howled there, bitter as regret. But the trail of blood, speckled with bare footprints, pulled her forward like a noose. She gripped the bucket tighter, its handle biting her palm. Stories of Apache ambushes flickered in her mind, tales of scalped settlers burning homesteads. Her husband's face, pale and still, flashed before her. She should turn back, fetch the shotgun from the mantel, but the footprints were small, uneven, not a warrior's tread. She crept closer, the stable's shadow swallowing her. The air stank of damp wood and decay, wind whistling through cracked boards like a low moan. Inside, against a crumbled stone wall, she saw her. A young Apache woman, curled tight, her buckskin dress torn and soaked dark, her belly swelled heavy with child, straining against the fabric. Blood streaked her braid, matted to her cheek. Her bare feet, cracked and raw, bled into the dirt. Old rope burns circled her wrists, the skin purpled and torn. Her breath came in shallow gasps, each one a fight. Her eyes, half open, stared through Margaret, not at her, as if death already had one hand on her shoulder. Margaret froze, the bucket slipping from her grip, water splashing her boots. Fear coiled in her gut, sharp as barbed wire. This was no ordinary fugitive. The rope marks, the blood. They spoke of captivity, escape, maybe worse. If the townsfolk found her, they'd drag Margaret to the square and brand her a traitor. She could still hear their jeers from when she buried her husband without a preacher. She's half wild herself. Helping this woman could cost her the cabin, her fragile place in their world. She took a step back, boots scuffing straw. Then the woman's hand twitched, sliding over her belly, fingers splayed as if shielding the life inside. It wasn't a plea, just instinct, raw and fierce. Margaret's throat tightened. She'd never borne a child, never felt that weight. But she knew loss, knew the ache of a hand that would never reach back. Her husband's last breath had taken something from her, left her hollow. This stranger, bleeding out in her stable, was someone's wife, someone's hope, maybe someone's ghost, too. She dropped to her knees, the cold biting through her skirt. Her hands shook as she unhooked the wool blanket from her shoulders, the last gift from her wedding day, its edges frayed, but warm. She draped it over the woman, tucking it around her swollen frame. The stranger flinched, eyes flickering with something like shame, then stilled. Margaret's fingers brushed her cheek, cold as riverstone. "You're not dying here," she whispered, though she didn't know if the words were for the woman or herself. She dragged the woman deeper into the stable, past rusted tools and rotting hay, to a corner where the wind couldn't reach. The woman's weight sagged against her, heavy with fever. Margaret's heart hammered as she propped herself against a bale, the blanket catching flecks of blood. She didn't know her name, didn't know if she'd live till noon. But the choice was made. If the townsfolk came, if the Apache tracked her here, Margaret would face them. She'd hidden from the world long enough. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the cabin's outline. Hoofbeats echoed faintly down the trail. Maybe a traitor, maybe trouble. Margaret straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. The stable door creaked shut behind her, sealing her secret. She didn't look back. Not yet. Margaret's boots left faint prints in the frost as she trudged back to the cabin, the stable door's creak fading behind her. The Arizona Territory's winter of 1879 gnawed at her knuckles, but her mind burned hotter than any cold. She'd crossed a line, hiding an Apache woman in her stable, a choice that could bury her in this unforgiving land. Dawn's fog clung to the plains, muffling the world, but danger felt close, like a coyote's eyes glinting just beyond the firelight. Inside the cabin, she stoked the hearth, embers spitting like whispered warnings. The shotgun leaned against the wall, untouched, but heavy with temptation. She couldn't name the woman she'd saved, didn't know if she'd see dusk. But those rope-burned wrists, that swollen belly, they carved themselves into Margaret's thoughts, sharper than any blade. She sliced stale bread, tucked half into her apron, and slipped a strip of salt pork from the pantry. Her hands moved fast, practiced at hiding. The townsfolk never looked too close, but a stray glance could unravel everything. By noon, the fog thinned, and hoofbeats rattled down the trail. Margaret's heart lurched. She peered through the cabin's cracked window, apron bunched in her fists. It was only Amos, the horse trader, his wagon creaking under a load of feed. "Got your oats, Widow Hale?" he called, voice rough as gravel. She stepped onto the porch, forcing a nod. His eyes roamed the yard, lingering on the stable's sagging roof. "Heard talk of trouble. Tracks near the ridge. Have you seen anything?" "Nothing but frost," she lied, her throat dry as dust. Amos squinted, chewing his pipe. "Keep that gun close. Apache doesn't leave tracks for no reason." He unhitched the sacks, boots scuffing near the bloodied path she'd swept clean at dawn. Margaret's pulse hammered as she handed him coins, urging him to leave. His wagon rumbled off, but his words hung like smoke. Tracks. Someone was watching. She waited until the trail was silent, then slipped to the stable, bread and pork hidden under her shawl. The door groaned, and the air inside stung with cold and the faint tang of blood. The Apache woman lay where she'd left her, blanketed in wool, eyes half open but sharper now, tracking Margaret's steps. Her braid, crusted with dirt, spilled over the hay. She was young, maybe 20, her face gaunt but fierce, like a hawk grounded but not broken. "You're awake," Margaret said, kneeling. She offered the bread. The woman's fingers, bruised and trembling, took it, tearing a small piece. She chewed slowly, eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "What's your name?" Margaret asked, voice low. A long pause, then a whisper, rough as wind over stone. "Nantai." Margaret nodded, testing the word. "I'm Margaret. You're safe here. A lie, maybe, but it felt like a vow. Nantai's gaze flickered to the stable's shadows, then back. "The child," she rasped, hand brushing her belly. "It's why I ran." Margaret's chest tightened. Ran from what? Nantai's jaw clenched, her silence louder than words. Soldiers, maybe. Or worse. The rope marks told a story Margaret didn't want to hear. She poured water from a tin flask, steadying Nantai's head as she drank. The woman coughed, a wet, rattling sound that made Margaret wince. Fever was coming, or already here. "You need a fire," she said, glancing at the stable's drafty walls. Nantai shook her head, weak but firm. "Smoke. They'll see." Margaret understood. Smoke could draw eyes, settlers, raiders, or the Apache who might be hunting her. But Nantai's shivers were a death knell. Margaret stacked hay bales to block the worst drafts, then struck flint over a small pile of twigs in a rusted feed trough. The flames caught, faint but warm, curling smoke toward a cracked roof beam. Night fell, black and heavy. Margaret returned to the cabin, but sleep wouldn't come. She sat by the window, watching the stable's outline. The dogs down the trail, usually sharp with barks, were silent. Too silent. Her skin prickled. She lit a lantern, its glow weak against the dark, and slipped back to the stable. Nantai was awake, propped against the bale, clutching the blanket. "You hear it?" she whispered. Margaret frowned. "Hear what?" Nantai's eyes were fixed on the door. "Nothing. That's what scares me." Margaret followed her gaze. The prairie held its breath. No wind, no owls, no distant hooves. Then, faint as a ghost, a shadow shifted on the ridge. A rider, maybe two. Gone before she could be sure. Her stomach knotted. Nantai's people, or someone else. "They're coming," Nantai said, voice steady but thin. "For you?" Margaret asked. Nantai's hand tightened on her belly. "For what I carry." Margaret's breath caught. This wasn't just a fugitive. Nantai was more. Maybe a chief's wife, maybe a symbol. And Margaret, with one blanket and a lie, had stepped into a storm she couldn't outrun. Nantai's words hung in the stable's chill, heavy as a storm cloud over the Arizona Territory's winter of 1879. Margaret's lantern flickered, casting jagged shadows on the hay-strewn floor. Riders on the ridge, ghosts in the dark, meant time was bleeding out. She bolted the stable door, her hand steady, but her gut twisting like barbed wire. The prairie's silence screamed louder than any war cry. Nantai, propped against the bale, clutched her belly, her eyes sharp with a truth Margaret wasn't ready to face. Whatever Nantai carried, it wasn't just a child. It was a spark that could set the frontier ablaze. Dawn broke gray, the sky bruised and low. Snow dusted the plains, softening the bloodstains Margaret had scrubbed from the frost days before. She hauled a sack of oats to the stable, her breath clouding in the cold, every step a gamble. The town, a few miles off, was stirring. Church bells clanged, not for prayer, but warning. Whispers of Apache tracks had spread, and with them, tales of betrayal. Margaret's name wasn't on their tongues yet, but suspicion was a noose tightening by the hour. Inside the stable, Nantai's fever had worsened. Her skin burned under the wool blanket, her coughs sharp and wet, rattling like loose nails in a coffin. Margaret knelt, pressing a damp cloth to her forehead. "Hold on," she muttered, more command than comfort. Nantai's eyes, glassy but fierce, met hers. "They'll kill you for this," she rasped. Margaret's jaw tightened. "Let them try." She didn't say it aloud, but the thought of Nantai's child, unborn, innocent, kept her hands moving, piling straw to shield the fire's glow, fetching water from a half-frozen creek. By midday, the stable reeked of smoke and sweat. Margaret built the fire higher, damn the risk. Nantai's shivers were a countdown. She fed her broth from a tin cup, spoon by spoon, her own hunger forgotten. Nantai spoke in fragments, her voice a cracked whip. My husband, a chief, he thinks I'm dead. Margaret froze, the spoon hovering. A chief's wife. That explained the riders, the silence. Nantai wasn't just running. She was a missing piece of a war the Apache wouldn't let go. Margaret's cabin, her solitude, was now a battlefield. Hoofbeats thudded closer. Not one rider, but many. Margaret doused the fire, smoke stinging her eyes, and peered through a slat. A posse from town, 6 men, rifles slung low, combed the trail, their voices carrying like gravel under boots. "Check every barn," one barked. "Someone's hiding them." Margaret's heart slammed against her ribs. She turned to Nantai, whose breathing had gone shallow, her hand limp over her belly. The woman who'd fought to live was slipping away, and with her, Margaret's fragile defiance. She grabbed the shotgun from the cabin, its weight unfamiliar, but cold as truth. Back in the stable, she stood guard, the barrel steady against the door. "You're not dying," she hissed at Nantai, though the woman's eyes were closed, her chest barely rising. The posse's boots crunched closer, their lanterns bobbing like wolves' eyes. Margaret's mind raced, every lie she'd told, every track she'd swept, crumbling under their glare. She'd saved Nantai only to lose her now, and herself with her. The town would hang her as a traitor, burn her cabin to ash. Her husband's grave, unmarked by the creek, would be all that remained. If this story's pulling you in, if Margaret's stand in that frozen stable speaks to you, hit subscribe and share where you're listening from. It's your support that keeps these tales alive, and trust me, you'll want to see how this ends. A shout from the posse snapped her back. "Hale's place! Check the stable!" Margaret's grip tightened on the shotgun. She glanced at Nantai, motionless, her face pale as the snow outside. The child's life, Nantai's fight. It was all slipping through her fingers. She'd staked everything on a stranger, and now the cost was coming due. The door rattled, a fist pounding. "Open up, Widow Hale!" Margaret stood, boots planted, ready to fire or fall. But Nantai's hand twitched, her eyes fluttering open, a faint spark in their depths. "Don't let them win," she whispered. Margaret's resolve hardened, but the posse's shadows loomed larger, and the ridge beyond was no longer empty. Dark figures watched, waiting for blood. Nantai's whispered defiance, "Don't let them win," burned in Margaret's ears as the posse's fists hammered the stable door. The Arizona Territory's winter of 1879 pressed against the walls, snow muffling the world but not the menace outside. Margaret's shotgun trembled in her grip, its barrel aimed at the splintering wood. The posse's shouts grew sharper, lanterns casting warped shadows through the slats. On the ridge, dark figures loomed, silent as death. Nantai lay still, her faint breath the only tether keeping Margaret from pulling the trigger. Then, a miracle. Nantai's eyes held hers, weak but alive. The door held. The posse retreated, cursing, their boots fading into the night. Margaret exhaled, but the ridge's watchers didn't move. Sunrise bled pale across the plains, painting the snow in streaks of gold. Margaret hadn't slept, her body wired with dread. She checked Nantai, whose fever clung like damp rot, but her pulse was steady. The stable, a fragile sanctuary, reeked of ash and fear. Margaret slipped to the cabin for more broth, her eyes scanning the horizon. The ridge was empty now, or so it seemed. But the air felt wrong, taut as a bowstring. She returned to find Nantai sitting up, the wool blanket draped loose, her gaze fixed on the door. "They'll come again," Nantai said, voice raw but certain. Margaret nodded, handing her the broth. "Then we'll be ready." By mid-morning, hoofbeats echoed, slow and deliberate. Not the posse's reckless charge, but a single rider, his silhouette stark against the snow. Margaret peered through the stable slat, her heart a trapped bird. He was Apache, older, his face carved by time, scars tracing his cheeks like dry riverbeds. His wolfskin coat, too fine for a settler, marked him as someone who carried weight. He dismounted at the cabin's gate, his horse's breath steaming in the cold. No war paint, no weapon drawn, but his presence was a storm held in check. Margaret gripped the shotgun, stepping onto the porch. "You got no business here," she called, voice steady despite the quake in her bones. The man's eyes, deep as canyon shadows, met hers. "I am Blue Antler," he said, his voice low, like stones rolling down a slope. "We seek a woman who carries our future." Margaret's grip tightened. Nantai behind her stirred, her bare feet scuffing the straw as she rose, trembling but upright. The blanket trailed behind her, a tattered shield. "Stay back," Margaret hissed, but Nantai stepped forward, her eyes locked on Blue Antler. "I'm here," Nantai said, her voice a cracked bell. Blue Antler's gaze softened, not with pity, but reverence. He knelt, slow and deliberate, his knees crunching the snow. Margaret's breath caught. From the ridge, a ripple spread. Hundreds of Apache warriors, unseen until now, emerged from the haze, dismounting as one. They knelt, braids swaying in the wind, their silence louder than any war drum. This wasn't surrender. It was a reckoning, a nod to the life Margaret had preserved. The town's church bell tolled, frantic now, as settlers gathered on the distant road, rifles glinting. Margaret stood between worlds, the shotgun heavy in her hands. Blue Antler rose, his eyes on Nantai. "You were lost to us," he said. "This woman," he nodded to Margaret, "gave you back." Nantai's hand brushed her belly, her face unreadable. "She gave me more than that," she murmured. Margaret's throat tightened, but she said nothing. The weight of their gazes was enough. Blue Antler turned to her. "You've earned no peace from your people," he said, not unkindly. "But you have ours." He offered no promises, no gifts, just truth. Margaret nodded, the shotgun lowering. The warriors remained kneeling, a sea of shadows under the rising sun. Nantai stepped closer to Blue Antler, her strength faltering, but her will unbroken. She looked back at Margaret, a glance that carried years of unspoken loss. Then she walked toward her people, the blanket dragging in the snow. The townsfolk's shouts grew closer, their anger a gathering storm. Margaret knew what came next. Whispers of betrayal, a widow cast out. She'd saved Nantai, but the cost was her place in this brittle world. As the Apache began to turn, horses snorting in the cold, a new sound pierced the air, a faint cry, sharp and small, from Nantai's belly. The child, alive, kicking against the odds. Blue Antler's face shifted, a crack in his stone mask. Margaret's eyes burned, but she stood tall, the stable at her back, its walls a witness to a dawn that changed everything. The child's cry, sharp and defiant, echoed through the Arizona Territory's dawn in 1879, a spark in the snow-dusted silence. Margaret stood rooted, the stable's shadow at her back, as Blue Antler and his warriors turned their horses, vanishing into the haze. Nantai's glance lingered, a tether across worlds, before she followed her people, the wool blanket trailing like a faded flag. The townsfolk's shouts grew louder, their rifles glinting on the road. But Margaret felt the weight of something larger, a truth carved in that fleeting cry, a life she'd fought for, now slipping beyond her reach. The prairie held its breath, waiting for what came next. Winter deepened, snow piling against the cabin's walls like a siege. Margaret moved through her days, a ghost in her own home, her hands stitching coats, her eyes scanning the ridge, empty now, but never silent. The town turned on her, their whispers venomous. Traitor, they hissed in the market, their backs turned when she passed. Her stable, once a sanctuary, was a mark of shame. Settlers swore they'd burn it if she didn't leave. Yet she stayed, tethered to the memory of Nantai's survival, to the child whose cry had pierced the dawn. Nantai hadn't left, not entirely. A week after the warriors departed, Margaret found her in the stable, curled in the straw, feverish again, her belly still heavy. The journey had been too much. Margaret carried her to the cabin, laying her on a cot by the hearth. She brewed tea from sage, wiped Nantai's brow, and prayed, though she hadn't in years, for the child to hold on. Nantai's eyes, when open, held no fear, only a quiet resolve. "You should have let me go," she whispered once. Margaret shook her head. "Not while you're breathing." The child came in the dead of night, under a moon sharp as a blade. Nantai's cries were soft, fierce, like a hawk's call. Margaret, hands steady despite her fear, guided the birth, cutting the cord with a knife warmed by the fire. The baby, a girl small but alive, wailed, her voice a spark in the dark. Nantai named her Tawi, meaning dawn in her tongue. Margaret wrapped her in a clean cloth, her throat tight as she handed the child to her mother. Nantai's smile, faint but real, was a gift Margaret hadn't expected. Spring crept in, melting the snow, softening the plains. The town's anger didn't thaw. Men spat at Margaret's gate. Women crossed the street to avoid her shadow. She didn't care. Tawi's gurgles filled the cabin, a sound that drowned out their hate. Nantai grew stronger, her steps surer, but she spoke less of leaving. One evening, by the fire, she traced her daughter's face and said, "You gave us a home." Margaret shrugged, poking the embers. "Just a roof." Nantai's eyes held hers. More than that. Hoofbeats returned at the first green flush of the prairie. Margaret tensed, expecting the posse, but it was Blue Antler, alone, his horse picking through the mud. He dismounted, his scars catching the light. "She's ready," he said. Not a question. Margaret led him to the cabin, where Nantai sat with Tawi, the child's tiny hand clutching her braid. Blue Antler knelt, his voice low. "Your husband waits." Nantai nodded, but her gaze found Margaret, a silent question. Margaret swallowed, nodding back. "Go where you belong." Nantai packed nothing but the blanket, now patched with Margaret's thread. At the door, she paused, pressing a wooden eagle into Margaret's hand, its wings spread, carved with a care that spoke of nights by firelight. "For the one who saw me," she said. Their eyes locked, two women forged by loss, bound by a winter that rewrote their scars. Nantai and Tawi joined Blue Antler, their silhouettes fading into the horizon, leaving only hoofprints in the mud. Margaret stood alone, the eagle's weight small but eternal. The stable was empty, its walls creaking with memory. She found a nail, hung the eagle above the door, where it caught the sun's first rays. The town's scorn didn't fade. They'd never forgive her. But as she worked the fields, her hands calloused, her heart steady, she felt the prairie shift. Tawi's cry, Nantai's glance, the eagle's wings. They were hers, a legacy no fire could burn. The territory stretched wide, its winds whispering of a woman who'd faced hate and chosen life, leaving a mark deeper than any grave. Margaret's choice in that frozen Arizona winter left a mark deeper than any scar. Her courage, Nantai's survival, and Tawi's cry reshaped the prairie's heart. What do you think? Was her defiance worth the cost? Drop your thoughts below. Your voice keeps these stories alive. I'm grateful for every moment you spent riding this trail with me. Until the next tale, when the dust settles and new legends rise. Keep listening. Want to hear another frontier story that'll grip your soul? Let me know what moves you.